then a little bit on policy as well. So you know, we kind of jump around between disciplines and take what works and what is available and put it to use. So moose in British Columbia. Here we go. So the question is, why is this issue related to moose and wildlife management important? Broadly speaking, what's gone on over the last even 40 years has been that social expectations and legislation and regulation in British Columbia and across pretty much all of North America have increased. So people really expect more out of decision makers in public policy than they did 50 or 60 years ago. At the same time, as we have added complexity and legislation and regulation to wildlife managers' jobs or fish managers' jobs or forest managers' jobs, at the same time, in BC at least, we have decreased funding, decreased capacity, so the people who are there to do the work, which means that your ability to conduct science goes down. And with that, so does wildlife. So kind of three stools or three legs to the stool around natural resource management or renewable resource management. You need funding, so money, which helps you do science, which helps you understand what's going on the landscape, which allows you to make science-based decisions to help restore things. And then you need a governance piece, which we call social support, which is kind of people caring about this, this resource or these resources broadly. So here it is in a picture. This was work done in 2013 by a number of former ministry employees and a few researchers as well. And so this is the BC Renewable Resource Ministry budgets compared to the total provincial budget. So what you're going to see here basically is over time, as there's more people and more wealth, the provincial budget goes up. So this is all adjusted for inflation. So when we look at, 1974, when we start, the world is getting, better and better funded when we talk about things like healthcare and education. And when we look at renewable resource management, that's that blue line down at the bottom. So the long story short here is we have more people on the landscape. We have more threats to fish, wildlife, and habitat. Our budget is going up because we're generating more wealth, but at the same time, we are not investing in renewable resource management at the same rate. And so, naturally what you'd expect if you're taking this approach is that you have negative outcomes for things like the sustainability of fish, wildlife, and habitat. And there's a pile of work that we did behind this that kind of supports that. And I'll get a little bit more into the nuance here. Overall, we've seen an order of magnitude change as a proportion of the provincial budget. I think it was in the 1950s where they were spending around 0.08 or 0.07% or 0.7% of the provincial budget on fish and wildlife, and now it's an entire order of magnitude difference. So it's 0.07. So it's kind of like essentially what we've done over the last 60 years is we've taken a zero off of your paycheck if you're a person that cares about fish, wildlife, and habitat. This chart is just a very rough comparison between neighboring jurisdictions when we compare BC to other jurisdictions that are really close to us. And there's a lot of metrics here, but the bottom line, what falls out of this is that it looks like BC is spending less per hunted species, less per person, and less per square kilometer. Even when we know that as a jurisdiction here in Northwest North America, we probably have one of the most biodiverse jurisdictions. And of course, we have the most hunted big game species, as they call them. And even when we look at places that really have very few people and very, relatively limited threats to fish and wildlife, we see that Alaska and Yukon are spending orders of magnitude more on fish and wildlife management than British Columbia is. So long story short, we're doing a really poor job on all of these relevant metrics. And of course, it shows in our fish and wildlife populations. And so that brings us rapidly into moose and the world of moose harvest. I wish that we had really good metrics that would take us back to the 50s or 60s around moose populations in British Columbia. The reality is, we don't have really great data on that. What we do have is really great data related to moose hunter harvest. And so when we look back into the 70s, we're harvesting above 12,000 moose a year, 12, 13,000 moose a year. That happens again in the late 80s. And by 2018, we were down to 4,000 moose. And of course, with the sweeping changes that we've seen in the piece, we're probably going to be below 4,000 moose per year now. So, 13,000 sustainable harvest of 13,000 moose a year, or 12,500, all the way down to 4,000 or less. A decrease of 2/3 is quite a significant impact. And of course, what we saw back in these days is a general open season approach by and large to moose management. We saw a shift here in the early 80s in a few parts, and things have kind of slid ever since. So to bring it into context, by 2016, there were close to 60,000 people who applied for 8,000 limited entry hunting opportunities. The importance of moose is, there was a ministry document in 2000 that essentially said moose provided more meat than all other ungulates combined in previous decades. So for resident hunters in particular, and I'm sure for First Nations in a number of areas, moose are an extremely important species. They're super high demand. And so when we thought about trying to figure out hunters' preferences and willingness to pay, rather than looking just at a hunting license thing, we decided to look at moose because people seem to know more about them. They're really important and people are aware of these declines. And then, of course, there's a shift from general open season to limited entry hunting. And then, of course, we hear every year about how people don't get draws and how they would like to get draws. And so we see a lot of these kind of frustrations coming out on wildlife managers and on organizations and on individuals saying, getting tired of watching moose decline and head off into the ether like caribou did. When is someone going to do something about it? So now kind of to couch the world of moose hunting and hunting in BC as it relates to resident hunters, some of the research that I did in the past essentially indicates that provincially, nearly 80% of resident hunters self-identify as meat hunters first. And so that's, really true in the case of moose. They're looking for a legal animal. So if there is, a spike fork season, a season for an animal that has 2 points less on one side, you see really high participation rates. You don't see typically a lot of selection unless it's induced through regulations. Factors that affect the hunting experience are the opportunity to hunt annually, spending time with friends and family, and getting out in the wilderness. And so when we're doing the research, this helps us kind of program the way that we ask questions and kind of get at some nuanced answers. Now, one thing that's also really interesting with moose in British Columbia is that moose live here, right? They live in the interior. But what's really interesting with this is over 30% of moose limited entry hunting applicants actually live in the Lower Mainland, or they live on Vancouver Island. And so the people who want to go hunting don't actually live where moose are. And so that presents a little bit of an added layer for us as researchers in terms of how we consider our questions. The value of hunting for a lot of the folks that are on here, don't really need to explain it. Hunting contributes to wildlife and habitat conservation, supports endangered species recovery. It's an economic driver, estimated 1.8 billion across Canada and $350 million in expenditures in British Columbia. And at the individual level, it provides for sustenance and recreational value. I know that both of those words sometimes trigger people depending on, where and how we're talking about it. But the bottom line is hunting is not just about meat. There are other factors that affect the experience that people like to enjoy. So we have all this background, and then we need to turn this into a research question or objective. So we have what's going on with funding provincially. We have how BC compares to other jurisdictions. We have the trend in moose hunter harvest, and we know that moose are really important to resident hunters. So how do we try to figure out what their preferences are and what their willingness to pay is related to changes to moose and potentially wildlife management? And so the objectives in this research were twofold. One was to identify their perspectives relating to funding, governance, and management. So that's kind of the funding, science, and social support piece. And then estimating preferences and choices of resident hunters related to changes in moose management. So most everyone will be aware of the North American wildlife model of wildlife conservation model. It has been criticized. We covered a lot of that in the thesis. There are some challenges with it, but by and large, as a model, it certainly stands out compared to what happens across most of the globe. And there's a few really important things when we put an economic lens on this stuff and we think about it. Three of the really important tenets are that wildlife is a public trust resource, prohibition of commercial markets, and the democracy of hunting is standard. And those are really important from an economist perspective, because typically in the world of economics, we just have our supply and demand curve, and where the two intersect, that's kind of the world that we live in. And so in the case of having 8,000 moose hunting opportunities and 68,000 people who apply, normally we would just increase the price until the two of those meet. But the North American model is very different in the sense that it says, you know, this resource is something that's managed by the public for the public. We don't sell it commercially, and that there's kind of a democratic procedure behind it. And so that adds another layer of complexity to traditional economics. And so that gets into an area that we call non-market valuation, where we look at things that are common pool or common property kind of resources and figure out a way to value them. So in the case of hunting, moose and wildlife are a common pool resource. So they're rival in the sense that when there's hunters on the landscape, they're essentially competing for moose. So if one hunter harvests a moose, it's not available to the next hunter, but not excludable. And so what not excludable means is that as a British Columbian, in the context of the North American model of wildlife conservation, as long as you have a hunting license and you're following the law, you can apply just like the next person. Whereas, you know, we see in other parts of the world, again, this is driven really by how much wealth you have or how much land you own. And so you can be excluded in those, in other parts of the world. So there's a whole bunch of different methods to identify non-market valuation, to estimate these kind of parameters around hunters' preferences and willingness to pay. And one of them is a choice experiment. And this is kind of right at the leading edge. It's becoming more and more popular and is kind of considered the gold standard. And so what a choice experiment does essentially is it's used in a lot of other disciplines like transportation and marketing. And so this would be how a car manufacturer figures out what options people want in a car and what they're willing to pay. And so in life, you have these things that are trade-offs, right? So you have a limited amount of income, and the question is, do you want to go really fast? Do you want to save gas? So there's a trade-off there. And so statistically, we put these trade-offs in front of people. You know, does it have power windows or air conditioning or Bluetooth? And at the end of it, we can get a better sense of what people are willing to pay and what their preferences are around these different options. And so we can do this for things like moose hunting as well and forest management. So you all don't need to know, or probably don't want to know, all of the math that goes into this. But basically the way you roll out a choice experiment is you identify the problem, you identify and describe attributes. And so attributes would be these things like, how much horsepower does your car have? And so that gets you from one end where you go really fast and you burn all kinds of gas, whereas on the other end, you've got a little tiny car that's really cheap on gas, but isn't, you know, you're probably going to run out before you get to Vancouver and it's going to take you a long time. So those are attributes, and under those attributes, you have different levels. You have an experimental design, which no one's probably gonna be super interested in. You develop a questionnaire, you collect your data, and then you do your data analysis. So the first thing we did is did some focus groups and looked at these kind of broad questions related to moose management, specifically around funding, science, governance, moose management, those sorts of things. And so the focus group findings generally pointed us in the direction to say, you know, one, Fish and Wildlife is not adequately funded. That was pretty consistent. All license fees should be dedicated. That was also a very consistent message. It was, I think, almost unanimous, or was unanimous, that government was not doing an effective job managing moose. A lack of trust in elected officials came up numerous times throughout the focus groups. There was a big push that decision making should be done by professionals or by scientists as opposed to elected officials. So those two are kind of tied together, and that science should drive decisions. So really heavy on moving things away, I would say, or a lack of support for the elected officials model, and definitely a lot of support in the world of science. And then these other pieces around funding, and that funds should be dedicated to wildlife management, came across really strong. And so for the people who are not from BC, right now, approximately 20% of hunting license surcharge fees go to an organization called the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation. The majority of the remainder of fees go into general revenue, and they're redistributed one way or the other by essentially cabinets through Treasury Board. So a lot of folks in the United States, I mean, they have dedicated funding models where the license revenue has to be dedicated, and then the states can actually access federal excise taxes, and they come up with these hundreds of millions of dollars, which we saw previously. That's kind of how they do it. And when probably going to be some people who ask, well, how much money is enough? When you review the literature, it's never enough, and there's no silver bullet for any of this stuff, but there are things that seem to work and seem to improve the outcome. So after that, we went back and kind of analyzed all the focus group findings, and then looked at a whole bunch of other choice experiments and all the things that we know about hunters in BC to identify our attributes. So these things that are important to hunters, that we can give them a range of levels so that we can better observe their choices and understand what their preferences are. And so those attributes were, number one was harvestable surplus. And so harvestable surplus would be the number of moose available to resident hunters for harvest. And we use that essentially as a surrogate for the moose population for two reasons. One is we were unsure if that was relatable for hunters. And then the second one is, given the spatial distribution of moose, it doesn't, if there's a lot of moose in a really, really, really remote area, we were unsure how well that would play into hunters' decision making. The next one that came up in a big way was this trade-off between opportunity and harvest. And so what that means is that, we can let people go hunting a lot, but harvest very little. And so an example of that in BC would be like a spike fork moose season, where the only legal moose that's available is one that has 2 points or less on one antler. So that would be, really heavy on the opportunity, but really light on the harvest. And at the other end of that spectrum would be something like an any bull season, where any legal bull moose would be available for harvest. And so there's a trade-off there. If we have a spike fork season where those are the only ones that are open, we can let people go hunting a lot. And on the flip side, if we have a general open moose season where you can buy a tag over the counter and harvest a bull moose, we're not going to be able to let people go hunting as much. And so there's a trade-off across that spectrum. And there's things that we can do also. We can shift timing of the hunt outside of the rut. We can shorten the periods. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do to kind of control that attribute. The next one was governance. We gave people different options because elected officials came in so loud and clear as being a real challenge for our focus group attendees. And then we also put in the proportion of license fees. And as said, currently only about 20% of license fees are dedicated through HCTF. And so we gave people different levels to choose from around how much of the license fees were dedicated. And then at the bottom of that, you always have a payment vehicle. So a way that people can vote essentially on these opportunities. And the payment vehicle was just a moose license. So you would get your LEH and then you buy your moose tag, and then the moose tag would have different levels of cost associated with it. And again, that is also based on what we found in the focus groups. So here is kind of what it looks like when we do a bunch of math and come up with an experimental design. Harvestable surplus of moose was our first attribute. And so the options that respondents would get, the people who did the survey, would get a choice of 5,000 moose. And so this is based in 2017 numbers from what I recall. So they would get a choice of 5,000 moose available for harvest, 7,500 moose available for harvest, 10,000 moose available for harvest, or 12,500 moose available for harvest. So that would be, on your card, you would get one of those levels. And that helps inform your decision making, where you either select that alternative, or you select the status quo. For the opportunity versus harvest, we did a whole bunch of math, and I'll explain it a little bit, but essentially what we did is we looked at these levels of harvestable surplus, and then we figured out what the trade-off would be in terms of how often people could go hunting versus what the success rate would be. So in this case, if we had 5,000 moose available for harvest, one of the choices, one of the levels would be, as a hunter, you would get drawn once every 5 years. You would get an LEH, but your chances of harvesting a moose in that hunt would only be 19 out of 100. So you'd essentially have a 19% success rate. On the other end of the spectrum, we could have it so that you only get a moose draw once every 11 years, and we could drive up the success rate. So there would be a 42% success rate in that hunt. And so really what this question is driving at with these metrics is, do you want to go hunting more often with a lower chance of success on average, or do you want to go hunting less often with a really high chance of success? And so that's what all of this math does for us. It helps us identify these levels. And then on governance, we gave people 3 choices. One was elected officials, which is the status quo, and this is all defined in the survey. One was a game commission, which is similar to what you see in the United States, where essentially you have people who are knowledgeable about hunting, who either put up decision-making or make decisions. And so that model, of course, is also, you know, there's a lot of sensitivities and challenges related to that model, but it's an alternative. And then the third one was a multi-government, multi-stakeholder commission. And so this one is a little bit more nuanced as it relates to UNDRIP and DRIPA in BC and Canada. And essentially this approach would be, you know, First Nations government, the provincial government, and then multi-stakeholders. So it'd be like other conservation organizations, industry, are all part of the governance model. So those were the governance choices. And then share of license fees dedicated to wildlife management, we had the status quo at 20%. An alternative was 50%, and then another one where all license fees were dedicated. And then for the license fee, the payment vehicle, that went from anywhere from $25, which is the current, all the way up to $500. And so between all of these, we give people these choices, and then what we can see through there is we can observe their choices, and then we can estimate their preferences as a result of that. So I'm just going to talk about this opportunity versus harvest very quickly, just to give you all a better sense of what this means practically. We're not going to go through all the math. These are our different lines for our harvestable surplus. So this would be at 12,500 moose. These are the different levels here. So 10,000 moose, 7,500 moose, 5,000 moose. This is opportunity going up. This is success going up. Obviously, these are on different curves. And then this is the status quo. So this is where things are currently at with 5,000 moose. This is 1 in 7 years people get drawn. So when people make their selection in the choice experiment, if they end up on this side of that curve, that means that they want the opportunity to go hunting more, and they're willing to reduce their success rate. If they end up over here on the curve, that means that they want their success to increase, but they want to go hunting less frequently. These relationships are not linear. Obviously, as we get up to a lot of moose, people are probably going to want to trade that off, but this just gives us a way to essentially better understand the results of the math and of the econometrics that we do. So as a respondent, as somebody who got a survey, here's what you would see in the mail. So you're going to get a survey that has a whole bunch of questions at the start. We asked a bunch about these attributes and isolation of the choice experiment, just to get a better sense to make sure that our results line up with the choice experiment. We asked them a whole bunch of pieces about their views on governance to get a better handle on that. And then we had the choice experiment. And so each person would have got 3 cards, and these 3 cards would have this on the left, which is the status quo. This is what's going on right now. This is the norm, and then this is the alternative. And so as a respondent, if you don't like this alternative, then you're going to pick the status quo, and then we can identify the differences between the two. As a respondent, you would get 3 of these choice cards in your online email. And you know, when we look at other research, quite often you'll find that researchers throw a lot of cards at respondents, and there's a few things that happen. They start engaging in strategic behavior, so they essentially start gaming the system, and they can also get fatigued. So, we took a very conservative approach by only putting 3 cards in front of people so that we could avoid kind of some of those challenges that are expressed in the literature. So this is kind of the meat of where I'm going to show you the findings. This just gives you an intro around the online survey. So the online survey was distributed on our behalf by the province of BC, and we randomly sampled people who had applied to the LAH for a moose straw, or people who had purchased a moose tag over the counter. So the province contacted these people on our behalf, and you would get an online survey that you would have a look at. And so there's a bunch of sections. There's a background section, which was very similar to what I talked about in the first 5 slides. There was a section that showed the reader the attributes, defined the attributes, and then showed them the different levels. There were some qualitative questions around looking at these attributes in isolation of the choice cards. Then there were the choice cards, and then we came back around and looked at the governance characteristics again to kind of better understand why people seem to be so frustrated with the elected official part of running wildlife management. Individual specific variables, this is just really what we did around kind of estimating who was impacted, who would willing to pay more, who selected the status quo. These are just kind of covariates that we looked at in our model, amongst a number of others. So here are the results. And this question is in isolation of the choice experiment. So we just basically asked the respondents, once they got into the survey, how many moose would in isolation of any other changes, how many moose would you like to be available for harvestable surplus on an annual basis? And so what you see here is at the current level of 5,000 moose, we got about 23.5% of respondents that want to maintain 5,000 moose. And at 12,500, it's just under 27% of respondents. This was pretty surprising because we figured that most people would be in the 12,500 category. And we certainly, we didn't spend a lot of time testing this. But we certainly got the impression that, again, that hunters were being conservative as it related to regulations, and there was maybe some uncertainty around the sustainability of harvesting higher numbers of moose. So, if we had a do-over, we would probably spend a little bit more time on this piece. Opportunity versus harvest. We gave everybody these options with 5,000 moose available, you could pick to go hunting once every 11 years with a 42% chance of harvesting a moose, and then all the way to 1 in 5 years with a 19% chance of harvesting a moose. And unequivocally, 64% of respondents essentially said that they would rather go hunting more often with a lower chance of harvesting a moose than these folks at the other end, where 5.3% said, I'm okay getting a draw once every 11 years as long as I get a 42% success rate. So this one's leaning heavy on the opportunity side. We also asked it at 10,000 just to get a better sense of what's going on. And you can see that things are starting to creep up in terms of the frequency of being drawn. And then in terms of our respondents, they're kind of stacking up here between 1 and 2 years and 1 and 4 years in this adjustment in harvest. So the relationship, I guess, probably is not linear. When you have very low densities of moose, people want to go hunting more often with a lower chance of success, but it's likely as the moose population increases and you get closer to being able to go hunting every year, then this concept of being able to harvest or success rate goes up. Proportion of license fees dedicated. Here's the status quo. 20% is currently dedicated to wildlife management through HDTF. 3.9% of respondents wanted that. 63.7% wanted all of their license fees dedicated to moose and wildlife management. And on the governance model, we gave them the elected officials choice. Only 6.6% wanted to maintain the status quo. 61% selected the Game Commission. 32% selected the multi-government, multi-stakeholder commission. And then finally, cost of license. we just asked them, in isolation of any other changes to moose management, what's your preferred level of preferred cost for a moose tag? And 42% of respondents selected $25. That's good from, in terms of the way we were thinking, because that's the marginal utility of money and people are not getting any benefit from paying more. So that's kind of what we would expect. It was interesting that we had quite a high proportion of respondents that did select $50 as the cost of license. That was quite surprising, and maybe tends to indicate that, people, or at least some of the population, thinks that we're on the lower end in terms of the cost of license. Okay, now on to the governance piece. We asked about, we looked at the literature and tried to figure out what the important pieces are of governance. So what do people want to see out of wildlife management? What are the criteria that are important to them? And so we gave them the choice of conserves habitat and wildlife for future generations, makes science-based decision, it's truthful, fair, and can be trusted, spends money wisely, and communicates and listens. And so dark blue is most important, light blue is least important. And so the two that come in very strong are conserves habitat and wildlife for future generations and makes science-based decisions. Then followed by truthful, fair, and can be trusted, spends money wisely, communicates and listens. So it's really interesting because people always complain about process, which is kind of a little bit more down here. But it seems like what people want to see in governance is outcomes, right? And science-based decision making. So that was, these are kind of interesting findings. And then what we did is we looked at this again and we actually overlaid these 5 criteria on our 3 governance models: the elected officials, game commission, a multi-stakeholder, multi-government commission. And so this one is a pretty serious chart. But what you're going to get out of this is the yellow is where people are neutral as it relates to these different attributes. So communicates, listens, truthful and fair, blah, blah, blah. And then these different governance approaches. And so what you'll find is where there's elected officials, you're going to find that the majority of respondents are very negative in terms of they're saying, they somewhat disagree to strongly disagree that elected officials will conserve habitat and wildlife for future generations. They're really negative on elected officials spending money wisely, really negative on making science-based decisions, really negative on truthful, fair, and can be trusted, and really negative on communicates and listens. So just generally not a lot of support on that end. Whereas again, the Game Commission ranked relatively well, and also the multi-government, multi-stakeholder commission also definitely scored more positive than negative for sure. So that was just us really digging in on this governance issue to get a better handle on it. So for that part of the survey, this is kind of front end of it. Essentially what we got out of there is that people want to see more moose available for harvest. They want to see an increase of opportunity over harvest at current levels. They want to see all license fees dedicated. They'd like to see a move away from elected officials to a game commission. And overall, they'd like to maintain the $25 license fee. So this just gives us an idea to think about the status quo. Now we get into modeling all of this, and this gets very so part of the challenge with choice experiments, especially random parameter logit models, is it gets very hard to interpret and understand. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this other than essentially to say, the way this model does it is it gives us a mean willingness to pay in terms of the population, and then it kind of gives us an idea of how much variation there is in the population too. That's what the random parameters logit model does. So I'm going to start here on license fee. This is one of our attributes, and it's negative and significant. And what that means is that, license fees essentially represents the marginal utility income, which is what we would expect. And so what people are saying in essence is, I do not want to give up my money for free. Like, there has to be something in it for me, which is what we expected. The share of license fees was significant and strong. We see a fair bit of relative of standard deviation there. But what the respondents here are telling us is that given the choice, they would prefer the alternative, i.e. selecting something that says that the share of license fees are dedicated. Surplus, so this is the number of moose available, is also positive and significant. That means that people want more animals on the landscape. And then in this case, it shows that harvest is negative. And what that means is that at the current ratio between how often you get drawn and harvest, people's utility is negative. So that means that at this level, at the current level, their willingness to pay essentially is negative. So if we move in the other direction towards more increased opportunity, things are going to get positive. And then when we looked at the two different governance models, what we found is they're both significant, they're both positive, but what we see is the Game Commission comes in really strong with relatively low variation, but the multi-government, multi-stakeholder commission is less strong, and it also has a lot of variation. And so what this means is that overall, on average, people prefer this multi-government, multi-stakeholder commission. But because there's so much variation, it means that there are going to be a number of people who are really opposed to a multi-government, multi-stakeholder commission. That's what that indicates to us. So for the average person, most are going to select that over elected officials, but there are going to be a bunch of people who are really, really opposed to it. Hopefully that makes sense. And so here's the part that everybody wants to look at and see. And so these are the marginal willingness to pay calculations that we come up with. So in this case, this isn't super straight ahead for the reader. This is the ratio of marginal utility for a change in this attribute, and the marginal utility of income, where the marginal utility is in the denominator. And so these values are in addition to the current $25 license fee. And so essentially what this says is surplus is positive, it's $25.66. And so what this means is that for every 1,000 moose available for harvest, on average, resident hunters are willing to pay $25.66 per moose tag. So remember, that's on top of the $25. So what this is saying is, if we had an extra 1,000 moose available for resident hunters, on average, they'd be willing to pay $50.66 for their license. Harvest is negative, and I'll show you that next. I mean, basically what it means is that people get negative utility out of the current opportunity that they get. Share, so this is how much of license fees are dedicated to moose management. And so what this is saying is at 100% of license fees dedicated to moose management, people would be willing to pay $114.30 more. Now, the challenge with that is 20% of the license fee is already dedicated, so we actually have to reduce that down by 20%. So it's going to be about 80% of $114, so somewhere less than $100 plus $25. So you're essentially, if we dedicated all of the license fees to moose management, hunters would be willing to pay essentially somewhere around $95 or $93 plus their $25 tag. So you're looking at whatever that is, $118 for a moose license fee. So these are actually really big changes, 3, 4, 5 times more than they're currently paying. On the Game Commission, a change from elected officials to a Game Commission resulted in a willingness to pay of $124.17, in addition to the $25 license fee. And then down here, the multi-government, multi-stakeholder commission resulted in a positive willingness to pay of $65, in addition to the $25 license fee. And again, as said, there's a lot of variation in the model, which tends to indicate that on average, people are willing to pay this, but you're going to have people at the other end of this that are not going to be super thrilled about it. And so Yeah, these are, yeah, I won't get into the confidence intervals. I don't think anybody's going to be too excited about that. Okay, and so again, coming back to this opportunity versus harvest, what this means is that it was negative here. So what people are saying is from a shift from here to here, they would be willing to pay, or they would get positive utility of $12.12. And so all that, the willingness to pay that I showed in the last slide right here, all that means is that people are looking to move in this direction at this level of harvestable surplus. So those are that's kind of the results. There's a lot there, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, and there's a lot of time packed. The limitations around this is that this really only applies to limited entry hunting opportunities for bull moose. That's it. And again, those willingness to pay figures are for the mean, not the individual. And for some of those attributes, we saw a lot of variation. So we can say on average, hunters are willing to pay this much more or this much less. But we know that for some of those attributes, there are people who are going to be, really not supportive necessarily of those. But other things like the dedicating 100% of license fees really came in strong. Game Commission really came in strong. And then the other piece is if the harvestable surplus increases, other factors such as access, environmental quality, and crowding may become more important. You see in the literature, a lot of times researchers will focus on these things like environmental quality, like cut blocks, how much access there is, how many hunters are in this area. There's a lot of stuff around private land. And so, I think in BC right now, given the trajectory and the limited quantity of moose, people are indicating they really just want to go moose hunting. But if the moose population is restored and it gets back to what it was, then these other things are things that you're definitely going to want to include in a model. And so when we talk about policy suggestions, what we come up with is, if you dedicate all license fees, the willingness to pay is $91.45 in addition to the $25 fee. So when we do the math, I mean, essentially it's a four-fold increase in the four to five-fold increase in the cost of a moose license. Changes to governance, a willingness to pay between $65 and $124. At current harvestable surplus levels, focus on opportunity rather than harvest. And if the province gets on with restoring moose, the indication is that hunters are willing to pay $25 additional for their license fee per 1,000 moose. So what all of this means is that there is an opportunity to increase funding via hunting license fees by orders of magnitude for bull moose. That's essentially what we're getting at here. It improves resident hunters' utility, and it helps fund wildlife management. Now, of course, that is not going to be enough to fund wildlife management in BC, and certainly in places where they have way more money, it's still not enough money, but these could be used as incremental changes. And, it's very, very rare, especially in North America, to have people put up their hand and say, I'm willing to pay more tax if you do a better job of taking care of this resource and if you dedicate my fees to it. That's not super common here. It certainly is in the States, I think, around their funding model for fish and wildlife, but generally people in North America seem to have an aversion to paying tax. So those are the policy suggestions. Future research, we've got, I think, 17 hunted big game species now because grizzly bears are no longer hunted by a licensed hunting. But there is certainly a lot of potential to look at other high demand species like mule deer to get a better idea of what resident hunters' preferences are and willingness to pay around those species, keeping in mind, that hunters are a small proportion of the population, probably, well less than 5% in BC, but they do make up, in terms of funding, they do make up a substantial proportion. So before we get into Q&A, I just wanted to say thanks to the British Columbia Conservation Foundation for supporting this research. It took a long time to get done. The Osceola Fish and Game Club and the Kelowna District Fish and Game Club for hosting the focus groups that we conducted. The man in the middle is the late Al Martin, who was one of the big pushes to get me started on doing this work. And Al passed away from cancer a few years ago and was a major champion for fish and wildlife management in British Columbia, and certainly, super passionate. And then a whole bunch of folks at the Fish and Wildlife branch who helped us with data requests and getting the survey out to licensed hunters and a million other gaps that we found in the data. So with that, we're back to the first picture, which is a picture of a really great moose swamp somewhere in region 4. And Philippe, I guess it's 7:45, so I'll dig into some questions here. I see stuff in the chat. I think there's a Q&A function as well if you have questions, and then there's going to be people on Facebook Live as well, and Philippe will just relay those questions to me. So here, I'll turn my screen sharing off, maybe. Okay, here we go. Chat. Okay. Do we even have an option to not pay? We're forced to buy everything if we want to hunt. Do we have an option to not pay? So in the research and what we provided, people did have the option to select the status quo. They didn't have the option. We didn't give them an option to not pay anything for a moose tag. That wasn't kind of where we covered it, but we gave them the option to just say, no, I want the status quo. I do not want to pay more. I do not want changes to moose populations. And we gave that to people. And so in the science, you see a lot of people that they identify as protest respondents. And so these are people sometimes that are kind of gaming the system and are pressing no for various reasons that are not related to the research. So we did give people that option, but then we sent them to another series of questions if they continually selected the status quo. And we basically kind of tried to figure out if the reason they were selecting the status quo was, because they really couldn't afford to pay more, or because they didn't trust the government, or they didn't think the government would ever implement it, or that the researchers didn't know what they're doing, and gave them a bunch of different metrics. And so the people who looked like, they were either happy with the moose population or they genuinely couldn't afford to pay more, we kept them in sample. Whereas if we had people who just said, I don't trust the government at all, we removed them from the sample. And there's a bunch of different ways to treat that, but that's kind of the most current. So I would say in our research, it was not an option to not pay. And in the real world, if you don't pay, you're probably going to get in trouble for, if you're hunting without moose LEH or a license, you'll probably get in trouble. 30% statistics is same as all other provinces. Why not just have a higher overall percentage of all hunting tags and applications dedicated to wildlife conservation as opposed to really just singling out moose? That's a really good question. So the reason we singled out moose for this one was just to really dig in and get a better sense. Nobody's really done this kind of work in British Columbia, and we really wanted to do a good job of getting the attributes in line. I mean, ideally, you would do this for a number of different species. But if we just went down the route of a hunting license, it's really hard for people to see a line of sight between just charging more for a hunting license and getting outcomes. And I think that's part of this research in this field, is that in life and in purchasing things and in going hunting and fishing, there's trade-offs, right? There's trade-offs around mining, extraction, logging, hunting that we all have to face. And so this really dives into those trade-offs to help better understand it. I think there is an opportunity to look at other species for sure. Yeah, pretty sure it's not hunters decimating the moose population. Pretty sure it's industry. Yeah, certainly as it relates to licensed harvest in British Columbia, yes, our harvest rate is very low. Our sex ratios, generally speaking, are at or above provincial minimums. So yeah, licensed hunting as it relates to moose is not a limiting factor across most parts of the province. Would be awesome to see a percentage of industry permits going directly to wildlife as well. Yeah, I would agree with that. Hunting is not going to carry the day on its own, for sure, to restore wildlife populations. Does BC Wildlife Federation support deactivating of Forest Service roads and limiting access of areas previously huntable? I think the BC Wildlife Federation sits in the world of science as it relates to road densities, and the generally accepted road density as it relates to sustainability of wildlife is somewhere around 0.6 kilometers of road per square kilometer of habitat. And so deactivating roads doesn't really do it. Decommissioning roads is where you get the most juice for your squeeze. And I think as a science-based conservation organization, that's where the BCWF sits on that. Are the elected wildlife decision-making appointed by the elected provincial government or voted into decision-making? Oh, that's a good question. So, yep. So what is the elected official model? Essentially, you know, at the end of the day, cabinet and the relevant ministers are the ones who make the decisions as it relates to wildlife management in British Columbia. They do delegate that authority to the bureaucracy in cases, but a lot of the broader policy decisions are made at the political level. So really that option is really about cabinet and the minister essentially making those decisions. We need a ladder system, and all moose hunting is done by a group of 4. Tags are non-transferable. Yeah, I think this is a question related to the limited entry system. And so there is a bunch of work. I had a bunch of work in 2009. I believe the province is looking at, there's discussions happening with the province to look at the limited entry system as it's applied in British Columbia. And that's what I've got for questions in the chat. Philippe, I'm just going to pull up the Q&A. Okay, so of the 60,000 moose hunters, how many were respondents to the survey? I think for the most part, I think we had around probably about 2,400 respondents. So we put out two survey blasts out to 5,000 hunters at a time. For 60,000 hunters for a sample size, just for like a mail out or random sample, you're probably going to need about 300 and something hunters. And then for the choice experiments, so we get enough variation across the population, I think we needed around 1,100 respondents, and we ended up with, I think, close to 2,400, and we kept somewhere over 2,000. So in terms of the statistics, we're way above the threshold that you would expect. Has there been any provincial government reaction or response to the survey? We just finished it up. It was just published through UBC, so I haven't had the opportunity to talk to the province about this. Probably our current government will jump on our Willis pay, but not actually do anything to increase opportunity. That's a good question. I don't necessarily have a good answer, but I think that question really points at this lack of trust in elected officials that was so prevalent in the survey and in the research. So I don't have a good answer for you. When we did do the literature review, the government has recommended to itself, I can't remember how many times, 10 or 15 times, to dedicate all license fees. So this work certainly supports that. Probabilities in government are really hard to predict. Response regarding HCTF surcharge increase resolution passed the AG BCWF convention. That has gone to the Minister's Advisory Wildlife Council, and I believe that will be going to the minister if the minister hasn't already seen it. If the status quo is 5,000 moose available for harvest, and in light of dropping moose populations, how is it possible to see greater than 10,000 moose available for harvest? Yeah, it's a good question. And so that was basically a surrogate for the moose population. So the harvestable surplus would only be able to be adjusted as the moose population grows. So that number is theoretical in nature. We know that in the past we had that number that was available for harvest that was sustainable. So you know, you should, if you spend time to focus on moose restoration, should be able to get there. But it is a theoretical number at this time. Do you see any generational differences in your findings? Yeah, that's a good question. So we had age down. And typically what you find in the literature is that as people get older, they are less willing to pay. And so there was one really interesting finding. So in British Columbia, seniors get a discounted basic hunting license. I think it's like $5 as opposed to the $20 or $25. And our protest respondents, the people who selected the status quo 3 times in a row, when we analyze that, people who were over 65 were disproportionately represented in that sample, like by quite a significant amount. So there were a bunch of people that were genuinely saying, I cannot afford to pay more, that were in that 65 plus age bracket. But when we threw age into our model, it was not significant. We expected it to be, because that's been the way it has been in other in other choice experiments. But that's not what we found in this case. So really good question. We didn't really see that. And, you know, part of the discussion, we didn't, you know, it's not in the thesis. We did look at age a little bit, and there's definitely, like, I think, a trade-off between younger people who don't know what they're missing and older people who know what they're missing. I mean, there's probably some other socioeconomic variables that are, you know, influencing that, in the sense that really, you know, older people had, you know, relatively well-paying jobs as compared to how much their house costs. Housing is kind of out of touch for young people now. So there's a whole bunch of things at play there. But we did find that seniors in that 65 plus were disproportionately represented as status quo selectors, and they were genuinely saying that they could not afford to pay more. So there was a bit of a squeeze, but when we looked at it as a population, age was not significant, and it was like just slightly negative. So that was a bit surprising. Okay. Here we go. Any more questions? I think I've gotten through all of them. There are probably some more. Philippe, do you have anything more for me there?
Let's see. I think Rob Wilson is asking, is curious to know what comes next. What does BCWF intend to do with their findings in this regard?
Yeah, and so this one's a bit of a strange one, because I did this research on my own. It's not a BCWF initiative. So this one would have to go in front of the BCWF board. As part of my research, I do intend on you know, putting this in front of the province and meeting with the ministers to relay this, and what the BCWF does with it. That's going to have to go to the monthly board meeting, and the board will give me direction in terms of what they want to see happen with this research. Okay, bear questions. What can we do about the grizzly bear ban? Okay, so this is getting way away from the research. And stop spraying roadside. So a lot of these things, I mean, so there's a lot of, okay, so there's site specific issues that are coming up here. And I mean, the reality of this, and I think this is where it ties into a lot of frustration for people related to elected officials. In BC, we live in a highly political environment, and elected officials make trade-offs between things like resource extraction and the sustainability of fish, wildlife, and habitat, and then consumptive use under that on a daily basis. And so the question is, what can we do? You can have a loud voice. That's how you change things. And you know, this is not part of the research, but certainly when you look at what goes on south of the border, when they see things happen that they don't like, they go to their state legislature and they rally. So these are kind of social impetus to make things change, for sure. And that's really about showing up. What do the railways companies pay for killing moose in the winter months? They don't pay anything. There are some efforts to build some fencing and to deal with some issues. But again, that is not a legislative regulatory requirement to pay compensation around moose being killed on railways or on highways, for that matter. It's not part of the province. You'll see in the United States now, especially around wildlife overpasses and underpasses, they're actually putting it into budgets around how they move wildlife across the landscape as opposed to running it over. But that is not a political reality in British Columbia right now. Any other questions related to the research?
I think that's it for all of the questions that I can see.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate everyone tuning in tonight, and thanks for listening and asking your questions. And I guess Philippe will get a link to the thesis for the people that want to read the long version. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Again, these conservation webinars are really to help educate our members and the public around things that affect fish, wildlife, and habitat. So really want to thank you all for tuning in, and thanks Philippe for doing all of the background stuff tonight, and hope everyone has a great evening. Thanks.